So as per usual with a new edition of Warhammer 40k, it's a good time to be a Space Marine player. Lots of models already shown off by Games Workshop, and no doubt plenty more to come. So let's talk through Games Workshop's hints, teasers, and my predictions for what's coming next for the faction. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a video to talk about likely Space Marine releases coming in the near future. Marine Drama is certainly going to be getting a big wave of kits to follow the Leviathan box, and based on Games Workshop's past releases, I think we've got a fairly reasonable idea as to a fair few things that might be coming. At the moment, the main thing that a lot of us are waiting for in Warhammer 40k is the release of this Leviathan box. GW have spent much of the last month or so talking about it, and hopefully it shouldn't be too long before its release date for that. It does seem that Games Workshop's playing the 10th edition release very similar to Indomitus, perhaps not too surprising given how well 9th edition worked out for them. And if they're going by the same sort of pattern as that, we can basically expect a whole load more releases to come for both the Space Marines and the Tyranids, and the launch box will likely work out to be around about half or so of what's coming, with a whole load more to follow it up. Space Marines along with Tyranids are getting one of the first codexes of 10th edition, and they did confirm that literally all of the codexes would come with some new models released alongside, so Space Marines are guaranteed to get something, and I strongly suspect quite a bit. For the Space Marine releases that followed the Indomitus box last time, one of the major things that they came out with was a whole load of multi-part plastic kits for the miniatures within that box. We got multi-part kits for the Blade Guard, Eradicators, Assault Intercessors, and then the Outriders released just as a mono build kit without any additional options. The characters didn't get any new models that time, but they did release the sprues separately, and also had the characters present in upcoming Space Marine starter sets that followed the box. That wound up only really being the start though, as we had plenty more stuff announced following that. First up we had the Invader ATV and the Firestrike Servo Turret. They were announced very shortly after the box, and then GW followed up with the Gladiator Tank, the Storm Speeder, and the Heavy Intercessors and their Captain, though those last two were announced quite early, and then we had a very long wait for the models to come out. With how successful 8th and 9th edition Warhammer 40k have been, I'd be surprised if Games Workshop deviated too far from this pattern, and it really does imply that we're going to be getting a very generous release for Space Marines even after Leviathan is done and dusted. The thought of multi-part kits from the Leviathan box is pretty interesting, and then I think we've got a fair few reasonable guesses that we could make beyond that. First up, with multi-part kits from the Leviathan box, Terminators are basically guaranteed to get a full multi-part kit as a follow-up release to Leviathan. Games Workshop has confirmed that this new kit replaces the old one. The old one's going to be no longer available to buy in the not too distant future, but the new datasheet still has options for things like Cyclone missile launchers, heavy flamers, and chain fists, which these monopose models don't have. A lot of people have been wondering whether they might do dual build with the Terminator Assault Squad. My guess will be probably not, as that would be really quite a lot of parts to put in one box. They definitely could if they wanted to though. I think in reality it's a bit more likely that we see two different boxes to replace the standard Terminators and the Terminator Assault Squad kit. I think it would just be a bit of a weird move to redo the one and not the other. I don't think that we'd get anything to replace the Relic Terminators kit that we've got though. They might well redo that for Heresy at some stage, but it doesn't seem particularly likely in the near future, what with those Cataphractii Terminators coming in the Age of Darkness box. Then for another one that is basically confirmed to my mind are the new kit for the Sternguard veterans. Games Workshop confirmed that these Primaris models would indeed replace the current Firstborn ones, and I feel like with a kit with such varied options they'd be very unlikely just to leave them as monopose models and not have a full multi-part plastic one. Seems pretty likely to me that they'd want to have a kit that would allow you to choose between regular bolt guns and combi weapons at the very least, even if combi weapons seem to have a very similar consolidated profile. Plus options for heavy and special weapons and things. They are supposed to be ranged veterans with the options for all the fancy toys after all. If they gave the Blade Guard their own kit without any real significant war gear options, I can't help but think that these guys are going to get one. Next up we've got that Ballistus Dreadnought. Again I'd say almost certainly going to have its own multi-part plastic kit. We've had the Redemptor that had the option between the Onslaught Gatling Cannon and the big plasma, and then the Brutalis Dreadnought with the option between its fists and claws and a couple of hull-mounted weapons. Seeing as those two have two different loadouts, I strongly suspect that this one will get similar. Something similar with your big scary Dreadnought with two enormous guns mounted on the arms. If so, then perhaps the most interesting question is what sort of weapons he'll get. It could be anything from big melter weapons to hurricane bolters, or something more exotic like a huge grav cannon or neo-volkite weapon. If it had to guess one though based on past Space Marine kits, then maybe something like a dual autocannon dreadnought could be pretty cool. A lot of people have some fond memories for the Rifleman dreadnoughts that you could field in editions past. I suspect he will get a full multi-part kit based on the other ones. We did have an easy build Redemptor Dreadnought back in 8th edition that just had the Gatling cannon but didn't have the plasma. For the rest of the more frontline combat units out of the Leviathan box, I'd also guess that the Infernus squad will probably get a full multi-part plastic release, maybe kind of similar to how the Assault Intercessors did when they came out with Indomitus. I'd say maybe out of any of them, the Assault Intercessor box set was one of the least needed out of plastic kits, besides a bit of posing and things that only really added some war gear options for the Sergeant, and I can't help but think that with these Infernus Marines they're not really going to add very much besides some slightly different heads and things, and maybe a little bit of aesthetic customization. Probably feels like the least necessary out of full multi-part plastic kits, unless they decide to do something kind of radical with them and give them 2 different weapon options. That doesn't generally seem to have been the way that they've usually gone with Primaris Marines though. I guess we might get a bit of aesthetic variation on their flamethrowers. We have had things like Eradicators, Hellblasters, and Standard Intercessors that get an Assault and a Heavy version, though it does look like the rules distinction between those is going away in 10th edition. I suppose something like dual hand flamers could be kind of cool, seems a little bit unlikely though. Finally, for the Leviathan box, we have the characters, the Terminator Captain with the Gravis Apothecary, the Terminator Librarian, and the Unique Lieutenant. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't get individual releases for most of them, but I feel like the Terminator Captain is actually odds on to get a multi-part plastic kit, just judging by the datasheet that we've seen previewed for him. Listed on his upgrades are things like a relic shield to give him an extra wound, a pair of lightning claws, and a whole bunch of other stuff that this model doesn't have, and also no other Terminator captains have in Warhammer 40k. Games Workshop seem to be going pretty heavily into no model, no rules in recent releases and in 10th edition, and to me that implies that we're probably going to be getting a full plastic kit for this guy, seemingly with a fair few flexible options. I also can't help but think that while this miniature is really quite cool with him standing on the severed Carnifex head, I feel that a lot of people would at least like the option of a base that doesn't have that on. It could look a bit weird if your army just doesn't really have any particular history fighting the Tyranids, or on battlefields where he's fighting other foes and he still seems to be stomping a Carnifex head into the dirt. Then moving beyond multi-part kits from the Leviathan box, which will be getting some more good value Space Marines and Tyranid discount boxes, with things like starter sets and combat patrols being re-released. In 9th edition, we've had the Recruit, Elite, and Command sets, Warhammer 40k starter boxes that are discounted far beyond Games Workshop's normal, though they do have the downside of coming with 2 different little factions within the same box, so maybe aren't quite as focused on, say, just Space Marines. The 9th edition starter boxes were a slimmed down offering of what the Leviathan box had in it, usually just 1 or 2 small squads plus the character. I quite like the way that they designed it, so one box had one character with the lieutenant in, and the higher up box has the captain in, so you could buy both of them quite credibly. My tentative guess for these is that the 10th edition starter boxes might well be able to be combined or just have some sort of offering where you can make this combat patrol that Games Workshop has shown off, Strike Force Octavius, Terminator Captain and Librarian, plus the Terminators and an Infernus squad. It's definitely not impossible that this could be released as a standalone combat patrol box, but if it is and it's just the monopose kits, then it's going to be about the worst deal for a combat patrol set that Games Workshop's ever released. For the amount that they sell these models for separately, it's just a little bit light compared with just about any other Space Marine combat patrol, particularly as you only get half the 10 models in the Infernus squad here. What I'd quite like to see would be a recruit style box set with one of these characters, maybe with the 5 Infernus Marines in, and then perhaps an elite style box set with the other one, and then maybe some Infernus Marines and Terminators, again all fighting against Tyranids of some sort. I guess we'll see if that winds up being anywhere near accurate. There is at least a reasonable chance that they get it released as a combat patrol. I guess they'll have to redo the Tyranids one, as that one's got the old Termagants in. So at least there's a fair chance they phase out the Space Marine Combat Patrol and re-release something different. Either way, my guess is that Infernus Marines and Terminators will probably be pretty easy to come by in 10th edition, appearing in at least 1 or more value sets post-Leviathan. Then beyond the Leviathan miniatures, we get into slightly more uncharted territory, and the possibilities for the very likely Space Marine release wave that's coming alongside the Codex. First up, for something that I consider pretty much confirmed to be coming at some point, will be Jump Pack Primaris. Along with upscaled Terminators, this was perhaps the one battlefield role that's clearly been the most requested by fans since 9th edition came out. It is just perhaps kind of odd that with all the Primaris releases that Games Workshop has come out with, they haven't yet got any Space Marines that jump around on jump packs, hurtle down from the sky and chop you up with a chainsword or similar. Assault Marines are kind of iconic to the faction, and Vanguard veterans are very popular units in game. It's perhaps particularly weird considering that we've got 2 ranged jump pack units now in the Suppressors and the Inceptors. A lot of people would just rather have that jump pack used for speed to hurtle towards the enemy and attack them in combat. If they were to release some Jump Pack Primaris, then they could be kind of Sternguard style revamp of the Assault Squad, I guess. With 10th edition coming out, they genuinely are starting to replace Firstborn kits in earnest. The Sternguard, the Terminators, and the Space Marine Dreadnought have all been effectively replaced by Primaris kits now. It could easily be done for the Assault Squad, I suppose. Though I guess the other option would be to have some sort of unique Primaris unit in the same sort of battlefield role, maybe kind of similar to the Blade Guard's relation to the Vanguard veterans. Just give them an iconic loadout of a certain combination of combat weapons, maybe something like dual lightning claws or similar, and you could have a unit that doesn't necessarily update the Assault Squad and just is a viable option alongside them and Vanguard vets. We have of course had some pretty decent teasers as to how they might execute them. This Marine on the top right is from the Space Marine 2 preview trailers. It is a release that's clearly thought out with 10th edition in mind, given that the main antagonists are Tyranids. It'd be kind of weird to have Primaris Assault Squads winging around in that, and no way to realise that on the tabletop, or at least not officially from Games Workshop without converting. The new Dante model also sported a very similar jump pack as well. It does really help confirm that this is the way that Games Workshop will be going for Primaris Assault Marines at some stage, just depends on when. I certainly can't imagine a Blood Angels revamp in Primaris unless they had the basic options for Primaris Assault Marines already, much in the same way that it would have been kind of hard to do a new Deathwing revamp unless they did upscale Terminators like they have now. Another very strong option for the next range of kits could be an updated Scout design. These ones again feel like they're inevitable at some point, given that we had the Black Templars Neophytes. That Black Templars release has already predicted the Space Marine Infernus squad, with the Marine with the Pyreblaster that a lot of people were suspecting would get a full squad with it at some point. I feel like similar to Terminators, these guys wouldn't have to be a Primaris release per se. Various chapters use their neophytes and scouts differently. They might not necessarily have all the upgrades that truly makes them a Space Marine yet, let alone a Primaris Marine. And I feel like, as with the Terminators, you definitely wouldn't need to call them such. I feel like Games Workshop will just brand them as the new updated scouts. Again, seems very likely to me. I suspect that the most likely thing would be an update on the more combat-orientated ones, the ones with the options for combat blades and bolt pistols, or shotguns or bolters. Not sure whether they'd include parts for a new Scout Sniper kit. Games Workshop have already given a Sniper Scout type role to the Space Marine Eliminators. Not sure whether they'd put the effort into making another squad of Space Marine Snipers when they already have that battlefield role pretty well covered. I guess they might be competing a bit against the Phobos Marines for the infiltration type role, but I feel like the Scouts have enough of a different feel to them to make them interesting as well. Otherwise, despite Space Marine character releases already basically being in meme level territory, I think we're on Primaris Lieutenant 15 or so by now, there are still plenty of areas that they certainly could release new ones for. Given that in the Indomitors box we're getting a Terminator Captain and Librarian, it would be a bit odd if they didn't have a Terminator Chaplain to go along with that, as the three most iconic Space Marine leaders that typically lead your forces. GW has released a couple of those in the past. An upscale Terminator Chaplain seems like an easy win if you're having a big release that's focusing around Terminators. I feel like that's also been mentioned in plenty of other rumour compilations out there. Seems like perhaps the single most likely extra character to get if we get any. If and when Jump Pack Primaris released, that had opened the option for Primaris Jump characters, again captains, chaplains, and librarians. A bike captain or librarian also seems possible, and weirdly enough, despite the crazy amount of lieutenant releases, we still don't seem to have one in Gravis armor for whatever reason. I feel like when Games Workshop inevitably get round to releasing yet another Primaris lieutenant, a Gravis armor one might be a reasonable choice. Finally, another one that's kind of weirdly missing from the lineup, at least as a mainline model, is the Primaris Champion. For the rest of the Command Squad style miniatures from ages past, we've already got the Primaris Tech Marine, Apothecary, and Ancient. Just seems odd that he isn't a core part of the range yet. Games Workshop has recently done a pre-order for their limited edition Primaris Champion. Strangely enough, he's come back for a limited run made to order recently, but for some reason still isn't a core addition to the range yet. In general, I'd say that Jump Pack Primaris, Upscaled Scouts, and a few of those characters are perhaps some of the most likely things to get releases, but there's loads of other possibilities for Space Marines. I do suspect that they might surprise us with a few things. We could certainly have any number of established characters crossing the Rubicon. A Primaris Cato Sicarius seems kind of likely to happen at some point. We have already had artwork of him updated, so he seems like a matter of time, but basically any other popular Space Marine character with a firstborn model could definitely get an update. Otherwise, a Primaris style super heavy in plastic is another way that Games Workshop could go. They did release a couple of big centerpieces for the Necrons when they came out last time round, things like the Monolith Silent King and Void Dragon. Of all the hundreds of Space Marine kits that Games Workshop has come out with over the years, we still don't have a plastic super heavy for the Space Marines, at least not ones that are aimed at the regular 40k and not Horus Heresy. The Super Heavy Primaris Astrius is a fairly popular Forge World kit as they go. I really wouldn't be too surprised at all to see Games Workshop release something similar in plastic, though I suppose something tracked like a Fellblade style thing might be another possibility, though I guess that might be more aimed at Heresy if that came out. Of course, there's a crazy amount of other possibilities, maybe a Gladiator chassis equivalent of things like the Whirlwind or the Vindicator, Primaris Flyers, or things like an updated Drop Pod or Land Raider perhaps. But maybe another one that sticks out that could be an easy release for them could be a full kit for the suppressors. They're the ones that came out in the Space Marine Combat Patrol and that Shadow Spear box set, and a lot of people were expecting them to follow them up with a multi-part kit for them. Would be quite cool to see them with a different option thrown in, maybe an option to trade their autocannon for an Onslaught Gatling cannon or similar. That'd feel on brand enough with keeping enemy infantry low and preventing overwatch. Finally, one other confirmed thing that's going to be coming up in the near future is some sort of release for the Dark Angels. Their codex is going to be coming along in spring 2024, and Games Workshop has confirmed that every codex that they've announced so far will be at least getting some sort of model release. That means that we're getting something else new for the Dark Angels, and maybe the biggest question is if they're going to go for a really big revamp or just maybe one or two kits. Will the Dark Angels get a fairly big effort range refresh similar to the Black Templars? Again, if I had to guess or make predictions, I'd say that they probably would. It's been really quite a big deal for the Dark Angels recently, coming back to have their Primarch come back. They've also released Azrael recently. And now with the release of upscaled Terminators to fit in with the Primaris Marines, that paves the way that they could actually credibly update the Deathwing, as previously I think it would have been very weird to try and do some sort of Dark Angels range refresh and not do anything to do with Terminators. Bone-coloured Blade Guard are fine, but they're just not really the same. If they did go ahead with this sort of thing, then Black Templars have given us a very good idea of what to expect. They redid all the major characters for them. For the Dark Angels, I feel like first in the line of fire would be things like Ezekiel, Asmodai, Belial, and Samael. The Templars got some nice generic character options as well, so maybe they might have the option for a standard company master and maybe an interrogator chaplain. On the battle line, a Deathwing Terminator squad with Dark Angels heraldry and all their war gear options, but upscale to match with the new Terminators seems very likely indeed now. I would likely be paired with at least something for the Raven Wing. I'd guess most likely bikes and maybe some sort of update to the Black Knight kit perhaps. It would be pretty cool to see them do something different with the Outrider bikes. The kit that they have at the moment is very simple and a bit lacking in options. Otherwise, I feel like high on the priority list would be some proper robed hooded Dark Angels Primaris veterans. The upgrade kit for the Intercessors is just a little bit on the weak side, I'd say. Other possibilities could be a new combat patrol with some actual more unique models in them, again similar to the Templars, and perhaps an upgrade sprue with relics and things on it, possibly even some additional war gear options like they have with the Black Templar Neophytes. I feel like there's a good chance of next year being a very good year if you happen to collect Dark Angels. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a bit of discussion as to some of the things that are a bit more likely to come out for Space Marines, and here's just a very rough summary of things that we're perhaps more likely to see. For the Leviathan releases, I'm going to guess that we'll get a full multi-part kit for Terminators, Stern Guard, the Dreadnought, Captain and Infernus Marines, some nice Space Marine deals of some of the above, probably the Infernus Marines and Terminators in some starter box sets against the Tyranids, and potentially some sort of updated Space Marine Combat Patrol, though I guess we'll see how they work that. Then following that up with the Space Marine Codex release, I suspect that we've got a lot of things that we haven't seen yet, maybe around about 5 kits or so. Perhaps some of the most likely being a Terminator Assault Squad, Terminator Chaplain, Jump Pack Primaris, and Scouts or Neophytes. I'd be pretty surprised if we didn't see at least some of those. I'd guess that Games Workshop will throw in some things that haven't been teased quite so much yet. Then if I had to guess, I'd suspect that Dark Angels will probably get a Black Templar style release for them, given the release of the Lion and Azrael. That'd be most likely to follow a very similar pattern, probably Deathwing Terminators, Ravenwing Bikers, and Hooded Primaris perhaps, alongside a bunch of their iconic characters redone, and perhaps a Combat Patrol upgrade sprue and a couple of generic characters like a Company Master thrown in. I guess we'll see how much of that we wind up getting this time around. I feel like pretty much all of this is inevitable at some stage, it's just whether or not it happens in early 10th or later down the line. In any case, let me know your thoughts as to what might be coming next for the Space Marines. What do you think that we're most likely to see in terms of re-releases of the Leviathan things, plus new stuff for the Space Marine Codex and Dark Angels after that? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.